Greetings, diners, and welcome to another edition of the Collapse Cafe here on the Doomstead Diner. Today, I'm talking with an author and a university professor in Germany, William Hathaway. William has his own website called peacewriter.org, I think it is, or .com, I'm not sure.
.org. Yeah.
.org, yes, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And ran into one of his essays a little while ago, sent him an email in my usual fashion, and so here we are today, and we're going to be discussing a few things that the Collapse blogosphere is interested in. We'll be talking about war, historical war, as far as how the fascist states of America has waged it over the years, and we'll be talking about the refugee crisis and just some of William's thoughts on ongoing doom and how that is progressing around the world. William, welcome.
Thank you. It's early morning my time, and I'm glad to be here enjoying breakfast at the Doomstead Diner while R.E. enjoys his late evening snack. We're getting together across the continents.
It's midnight here in Alaska as we start this conversation. Let's get down to business. Your early years with experiencing war were during the Vietnam era. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience in Vietnam, how you ended up over there, what you did over there, and so forth?
Well, I started my writing career as a newspaper reporter in San Francisco. But what I really wanted to do was write books, like a lot of newspapermen. The early books of some of my favorite authors, Ernest Hemingway, Robert Graves, Norman Mailer, were about their war experiences. So in the 60s, as the USA began to invade Vietnam, beginning before the moral atrocity that was really clear to me, I joined the Special Forces to write a war novel. And the book that came out of that, A World of Hurt, it won a Reinhardt Foundation Award for its portrayal of, I was trying to get at the psychological roots of war. What inside us prompts us to want to run off and kill people? It seemed to me, from my experiences, that part of this, the emotional blockage that our culture instills in us, our repressive culture, and also the need for patriarchal approval, this yearning for acceptance in this hierarchy of the fathers, needing and wanting their approval, and being willing to sort of imitate their behavior. And the military, men are attracted to the military for both these reasons. It's a release for this emotional blockage, and they don't have to deal with a lot of emotions in that. They just follow, or kind of emotions are rather the primitive emotions of aggression, rather than the more tender emotions of love and caring, nurturing people. It has more with destroying them, and that comes easier in our culture, for men at least. My 3 years there in the Green Beret really soured me on the military and also on traditional masculinity. I've seen where traditional masculinity leads, really up close there. And it seemed to me that one attraction of combat is it's a substitute for eroticism. Combat is the ultimate sexual perversion, really, on some level. It also reduces our ability to love. Our society has degraded masculinity into aggressive competition and domination. Masculinity has become a deadly toxin, which is poisoning us, men and women. And we have to the men have to confront and overcome this part of us before men and women can get together again and heal it. So that was the theme of that book, the first book.
And when was that first book published? I guess it was basically nonfiction. It was done as a report.
No, it was a novel, and then that was published in the early 80s. It took me a long time to write that book, partially because I had pretty strong PTSD when I came back. Couldn't write very well. Plus, I got into drugs. I was into drugs before the Army, and then after the Army, and they don't really help you to write. I used to think, at the time I thought they did, but then I'd reread what I wrote when I was high, and it was just pretty much gibberish.
Well, it kind of depends on who you were, I think. For Hunter Thompson, they were very helpful in his writing.
At the early days, yeah, but he hasn't written anything in a long time.
He's dead now, so you don't write a lot from the grave. But yeah, I think it varies from individual to individual on how you react to being in an altered state of consciousness in writing. But for yourself, it delayed your writing, and probably the PTSD.
But I found a better way to get off of the altered state that I found to be more productive was transcendental meditation. I started TM after about a year after I got out. that made a big change, and I was able to finally really make progress on the book and to get away from the drugs. By that time, also, it had been clear that the drugs were fairly destructive. The whole blossoming scene that was happening.
Now, what was the date of your return from Vietnam? When did you actually come back and get out of the Green Beret?
I got out in the fall of '67. Moved back to the San Francisco area at that time. Great time to be there. The
Summer of Love.
Yeah. And then later, I wrote a nonfiction book. I became more involved in the peace movement and got involved with a group of militant peace moving beyond demonstration and protest to get alternate ways of social change. And the nonfiction book, it's about, we're a group of domestic insurgents who've given up on petitions and demonstrations and protests. And instead of trying to bring the political and economic system down with a program of sedition, subversion, and sabotage, ties into the doom scenario, we feel, well, why wait? we have to break the system and before we can build anything really new. So some of these people are going to the extremes of destroying computer systems and helping soldiers to desert, trashing recruiting offices, burning military equipment, and sabotaging defense contractors. The book takes us into their lives. They're criminals for peace, basically, who are working underground in secret cells to undermine the empire. But the book also interviews some spiritual-oriented activists who are using transcendental meditation, some Christians and a Buddhist to try to bring peace, too, from that direction.
What was the title of that book, and when did that
Radical Peace. Radical Peace. Because it does seem that doom, you've done a marvelous job here of documenting the fact that doom is not a paranoid fantasy, but it's an imperial fact. You dug out the statistics and explained what these statistics mean, what these facts mean for our future.
Well, not just myself. I mean, there's quite a community of people that have been digging this up, kind of like stand on the shoulders of giants, so to speak. You're always looking around for the information, and for myself, I got a wake-up call in 2008, but there were other people who saw what was in the cards earlier than that. But once I did understand the nature of the dynamic, then probably between 2008 and 2009, I did the main portion of my research and drew my conclusions. And ever since then, basically just been rehashing and re-examining, more detail what's going on. But the general principles of it, I understood well by 2009. It's progressing along pretty much just the way I saw it at the time. The only thing that hasn't really come out exactly as I had thought it would is the timeline. The timeline's dragging out longer than I thought it would. But it's the general progress is correct.
Because the people on the other side, they're aware of this problem too, and they have a lot of resources to try to delay the inevitable. Sort of the après le déluge, as long as they can keep making their profits, if their grandchildren end up with doesn't concern them. Actually, there's a psychological dimension to all this, to the scenario that complicates the problem. Capitalism is obviously doomed, but also the human personality type that capitalism produces is also doomed. And that's us. That's our personality. We're each going to have to change. And your site gets at some of that, how to prepare for this. The behavior that we're used to, that seems natural to us, is not going to work anymore as this evolves. Because our outlook on life has been shaped by a society that prizes aggressive competition, individual self-seeking. We're brought up to look out for number one. And so we think in terms of individual solutions, survival strategies, how to become self-sufficient while the rest of the world goes down. But that's not a long-term solution. That just mere survival leads to a very degraded life for us. It seems to me that to fully develop as human beings, we need the rest of the world. We need things we can only get in an organized society. We all exist within the context of humanity, although the way we're raised, we tend not to see that. We tend to think, we're just autonomous individuals, but we really are in a matrix of other humanity. And that humanity is not doomed. What's doomed is capitalism, an economic system in which the resources of all the things all of us need are owned by a few people who use them to generate profits for themselves rather than to build a decent life for all of us. And they could do that, but then they wouldn't have their profits.
Sure,
What we're going to have to do.
it's a one against the other type of thing, and there's a very small number of people who are truly reaping the rewards, if you will, of raping the planet. That's what it boils down to. For that wealth to be distributed amongst population at large, I mean, there's been that goal has been around since days of Marx and Lenin, really, communism and so forth, to try to distribute the wealth in an equitable fashion. But that was not successful on that scale, large scale, over time, and was defeated essentially by the forces of capitalism, the forces of greed over the years. And so we, as a culturally have evolved in such a way, like you mentioned, that so every man for himself and greed is good and all of those ideals that are espoused by people who believe in the capitalist system. But in fact, all it has really served to do in the end is to more efficiently burn up our resources. The one deal that, I always come back to is the fact that people don't grasp onto how incredibly dependent we are on burning massive quantities of energy in order to be able to live the type of lifestyle that we do, and that many of the wars are actually, not all of them, are the result of this need that a small group of capitalists has to gain control over the resource and then issue the credit on the resource in order to get this whole little engine running. And that's basically what the capitalist system is. It's a little engine of its own. It's a heat engine of sorts.
That borrows on its petroleum assets. The axiom of this culture is that what the Soviet Union had was socialism, and that failed. Communism, socialism failed, and we've proven that. So that we have to forget that. But we've totally shut out the whole public discourse with us. Totally shut out the fact that wasn't socialism. They didn't even claim that it was. It was really a totally distorted system that Stalin derailed the socialist revolution and turned into something truly hideous. Other socialists have studied those failures and know where he went wrong. And now the basic facts of Marx have never been really implemented. For a very brief period of time after the revolution, they were. And they worked quite well until Stalin took over. It seems to me, we have to go back to some of those basics and figure out how we can take those resources that really belong to all of us, because we create that wealth. We create the wealth that the factories, the banks, the mines, the corporations own. We create it, but they own it. We're going to have to take it away from them and use those things to meet human needs rather than to make them rich. To do that, we can't withdraw from society. We have to reorganize the society so we can all get good health care, nutrition, clean environment, education, and really, very important, enough free time to enjoy life with our families, which with the work routine most people have now, with both parents working and everything, there's no real family life anymore. And that's not necessary to have a decent life. It's just that drive for profits forces us into that.
Well, if you go back into the 1970s at the beginning of the women's movement, that also dovetails with the same time that local peak oil was reached in the fascist states of America. In other words, we began our decline in the amount of oil produced locally. And in order to maintain standard of living, basically the women had to go out into the workforce. If they didn't, then family incomes would have been dropping much more precipitously than they did. So that women's movement actually corresponds to the same economic time period that we were going through, where a real income was shrinking. Now, this was masked by GDP and a lot of figures over the time period, by inflation and so forth. But the fact of the matter is that from the 1970s onward, late 1970s onward, that real incomes stagnated and now have in fact been declining for a number of years. But that was masked a lot by women going out into the workforce. And that women going out into the workforce business is also part of what has destroyed family life and destroyed a lot of community and a lot of the things that I think probably made us stronger in years gone by. It has fractured the society quite a bit. It's just an unfortunate aspect of the trajectory that we've been on in terms of accessing oil and becoming more industrialized and so forth. Those are all artifacts. At least that's the way I see it.
Yeah, also expanding the workforce, bringing women, enable them to expand the labor pool, enable them to start lowering wages also. Each person who's working at a lower wage is generating more profits than the higher wage person. A lot of that, we're still living in sort of the afterglow of a period of capitalism that allowed for some changes. From the 50s into the 70s, capitalism was in the Keynesian phase, when the main body, the main market for consumer goods was in the home country. North America and Europe had quite a bit of prosperity for the workers because they spent their money and they bought the stuff. And that stimulated the whole thing, as Keynes predicted.
It was an expansion. The expansionary period of the model basically was going on during that time, as the post-war years, and it was financed. All of it requires finance. Through the 50s is when the Eisenhower Interstate was built. That provided a huge level of employment, good employment at high wages for the construction workers and so forth that built the interstate. And then surrounding the interstates were built the bedroom communities and so forth. And then over in Europe, the Marshall Plan was implemented, and the Marshall Plan was used to rebuild Europe in the aftermath of the war. So there was a huge credit expansion through the 50s and 60s that enabled that feeling of prosperity, but of course it was all financed on debt. And that debt eventually comes home to roost, and it only gets bigger over time. As we see now, the kind of cancer enveloped the world after soaking up the United States, the fascist states of America, after soaking up Europe. Then it went after China, and China in the 70s changed from so-called communist system to much more of a capitalist dog-eat-dog type system that we have, and rapidly started consuming resources. And essentially, we offshored all the jobs, all the good jobs, and went to cheap labor in China and Mexico and other places. But those places got eaten up too, without ever getting the bennies that we got in the United States and Europe of living this sort of fantasy life of easy travel and just willy-nilly driving our cars around every day and throwing 2,000, 3,000 pounds hunks of metal up and down the highway for no reason. And that has basically ended up consuming the resource. And at the same time, we've got our population ballooning from 2 or 3 billion people in the post-war period to doubling up to 7 billion now. And all those people, of course, require resources too.
And the political climate now is, let's restore that prosperity. We can bring that back. And both major capitalist parties have their different approaches how we can bring that back. They're selling snake oil because it's not going to come back. But they're trying to, we still haven't woken up to that fact that capitalism goes through phases. And the phase, we've left that Keynesian phase of expansion. And now that these new capitalist powers like Russia and China and India are on the rise, to compete with them, our corporations, well, the Western corporations, have to lower wages because wages are low there. Otherwise, they go under. It's not just the problem of greed necessarily so much as capitalism demands that greed to survive. Because it is, as you say, it is dog eat dog. We will go under if we don't control that oil. That's the only way we can maintain our dominance is with these wars over these resources. And so they can't raise wages again. And they have to slash. They have to actually decrease the workers to be competitive with the rising capitalist markets. So that ain't going to come back. We're going to have to take it away from them. We're going to have to change the whole system. And I think we can do that. That system is doomed, and that old personality type that aggressive, individualistic, all for me type is doomed. But what that doom means is we're on the verge now of a whole new phase of human development. The little chick that's inside the egg, she's picking at her shell, trying to find the way out. And now we're starting to panic and everything. What's going to happen? And there's so much anxiety about this. That means she's ready to break through, break out of that shell into a new life. It's going to be a long struggle. But we're that little chick. We can do it, but we need to do it together. One of the energies I pick up on your site is this is a tremendous opportunity. We can create something very different and really good chance of very much better than what we now have if we work together.
Yeah, that is absolutely. My personal focus is, although, a lot of people, when they read the title Doomstead Diner, focus on problems that we have, say, oh boy, this is very negative and so forth. Well, yeah, I understand that looking at failure and the causes of failure can, be a pretty negative experience. But at the same time, you have to examine that and say, okay, what can we do about this? Where can we go from here? Instead of being nihilistic and woe is me and all the rest of that, what positive steps can we take to change things? And I think for the vast majority of the population, change has to be forced on them.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen until, basically, until the lights don't go on when they flick the switch, until the water doesn't go on when you turn the dial on your faucet. When those things happen, the population at large will start to wake up. In the meantime, people who do make themselves aware of these things can start to think about, at the very least, how do you operate? How do you make your changes? How do you change your life? What do you need? The thing that I try to force to people is what they really need is not preps, although preps are important, but they need community. They need to get together with others, and they need to work in such a way, in a fashion, that helps the group as a whole, not necessarily helps the individual. But that development of community is probably the most difficult step.
Because we're not used to it at all.
No.
Especially out in the West. I grew up in Wyoming, and you're in Alaska. There's this ethos of the mountain man. We go out and do it ourselves. We lick the wilderness. We fight. We build our own life. And that's very romantic, but it's really a fantasy. Even then, it was a horrible. Those mountain men were mostly sociopaths who were incapable of living in civilization, and that's not the real path for a decent future for us. But as you say, it's the cooperativeness that we need to develop, and also a sense of maintaining the beauty of nature. We can't really have a decent environment under capitalism. We can fix a few problems within that system, but then they pop up somewhere else. As long as profit rules everything, the environment is going to be degraded. Just like human life gets degraded, our labor gets degraded.
Yeah, it's a whack-a-mole problem. Any techno fix to a problem that you had just develops more problems that you need more techno fix for. And so you get in this never-ending spiral of techno fixes, and each one is more energy dependent than the last one. So it just accelerates the depletion of the energy resource, and basically all organisms need energy resource to continue onward against the entropy factors, and you can't win that way. The only way you can win in this situation is to be able to scale back in some manner until you reach a point at which the energy you're expending is equal to or less than the energy you can acquire each day, which basically comes from the sun and what the sun produces. And so you have to, you can't rely on anything else beyond that. To achieve that reduction, because it is a reduction, there's a huge amount of energy stored in fossil fuels, millions of years worth of it, and it's all packaged up nicely in this liquid form that is very easy to use. Solar energy and wind energy and hydrodynamics, wave energy and so forth. Those are very widely distributed forms of energy and are very hard to concentrate up. You got to live with the fact that you're not going to be able to live such a high energy lifestyle as we currently do. But that is the biggest deal. People just are once they get a taste of the wonders of being able to drive around and fly in jet planes to Hawaii and have vacations and stuff like that. Once they get used to that stuff and believe it's possible in perpetuity, they don't want to let go of it. That's really where it's at. And you have a class of people, basically in Europe and in the United States, but China also has its upper classes. You've got a class of people that don't believe that they ever have to give that up. It's a God-given right to be able to fly these planes and all the rest of that stuff. And I'm not talking just the 0.01% with their private jets. I'm talking about the average person who flies econo class. Even flying economy on an airline is a huge, huge energy waster.
This individual consumption problem that we have to learn to deal with less. But it turns out, as you know, that the single largest consumer of oil in the world, the single largest organization, is the United States military.
Of course.
They're the biggest. These battleships and planes burn up enormous amounts of fuel. So a huge amount of our expenditure is due to these wars, which are to get more oil.
Right.
If we didn't fight the wars,
they burn the oil to fight to get the oil.
If we can overthrow that system, we can have modest individual consumption. You're right. We all can't keep flying around the world. If we had more inner self-sufficiency and self-contentment, we wouldn't need to do that either. We wouldn't need so much. It's this desperate seeking for externals that capitalism promotes, this constant consumption mentality that turns whole life into a consumption experience. We consume vacations, experiences.
To me, it's all
because
reflected.
We're empty inside.
It's all reflected in the terminology that's used. I mean, what do they call people? We're not called citizens or people. We're called consumers. That's our job, is to consume. And people, do that. That's what, and then the more they're encouraged to consume, the more they consume. And so what do you get? You get a whole country full of fat people. And people just sit in front of their iPhone or whatever and press the buttons and so forth. A very totally shallow type of life that doesn't have a lot of meaning. There's a lot of spirituality to it. Understanding, compassion for others, and all of those things that I think are really the values that you need to encourage, not the consumption values of being a meat package. Meat packages consume. So, but you have to encourage more of the spiritual and mental side of it, and the feelings for each other, and feelings of compassion and whatnot. So, anyway, that's our good philosophical start to the chat. I want to get down to some brass tacks here a little bit on stuff that's going on. Can you give me some of your thoughts about what's going on with a refugee situation? I know you're in Germany, and there's quite a rise of the right wing in the European nations these days. We've been talking about the refugee crisis a lot on the diner. So what are your boots on the ground views from what's going on over there?
The Germans have been subjected to an enormous publicity campaign from the official media about Germany's obligation to help the world. We Germans did such terrible things to the world, and now we really have to make it up, and that's true, of course. And helping these refugees is the way to do that. We really have to do this. In the public discourse, there's no sense at all of the real cause why these refugees are here. They're here because NATO and Germany and most of the European countries are parts of NATO, as well, of course, as the United States, is at war in the Mideast. Where now these refugees are coming from these areas which NATO is working very hard to destabilize, to overthrow the governments. Now it's Syria. Before that, it was Libya, and before that, Iraq. And we're determined to overthrow these governments that don't follow our bidding. And we send massive amounts of arms there. We train these rebels there, and we send in teams to destabilize these areas. And when we start these wars there, and we do it as because these dictators are so terrible, but they're not. These dictators that we're trying to overthrow aren't nearly as bad as the dictators we're supporting. Assad, bad as he is not as bad as the rulers of Saudi Arabia and the other countries that are on our side over there. So
Yeah, all that's really important is whether the dictator will kowtow to Illuminati, as I like to call them, or the NATO establishment
yeah,
and whatnot, Anglo-American business community. If they are cooperative and can maintain control over their country, then the establishment does not give a shit as to
what they do.
what they do.
Yeah.
The Saudis
In
can
fact,
behead as many people as they want. They're still going to get support, right? As long as they're pumping the oil and sending it our way. But
we train them how to oppress their people and how to keep them down, because we don't want any kind of labor troubles there that might result in higher wages in the oil fields over there either. And so as the violence increases there, these people come desperately streaming north, and a lot of them are aware of this. We're not so much aware, they're aware of it. They see it happening there. The only way they can escape is to go into the areas that are basically responsible for the destructions of their countries. So some of them are bitter. Some of them come up as, to create sabotage here, to create attacks here, and others just want to have some peace. We, the NATO countries, have generated these refugees, and so we sort of have to take them on. But in Germany, they don't talk about that. In the U.S., they don't talk about it either. They just talk about, well, we have a humanitarian obligation to help these poor suffering people. They don't want to deal with the fact that they're here because of the wars we're waging in their countries. And so that has led to more right-wing feelings, more anti-refugee feelings. The Germans aren't a very open society in terms of foreigners. They've changed a lot, but there is this old tendency to not like the strange, the different coming into our society. That old mindset has been increased now. It's nowhere near, though. The right wing in Germany is nowhere near what it is in the United States. Germany is basically a much more progressive country than the United States. A tiny minority gets enormous publicity. The right wing is not a danger. It's an annoyance here, and it is increasing, not nearly to the extent that it's already apparent in the United States.
The right wing in the United States has been on the increase and gaining greater and greater strength, I think, basically since the Reagan era, although I could actually trace it back to the Nixon era. And similarly in Britain, Margaret Thatcher and her changes and reforms during that period. The two countries have mostly worked in lockstep, moving ever rightward and ever more conducive to business interests and large corporations and so forth, and essentially morphed into fascist state. Fascism is basically the fusion of the government apparatus with the corporate apparatus. That is what you're seeing now in spades, what is basically the control of a few large banks over entire agenda that the government is on. It's all about keeping those banks solvent and keeping that system running.
That's a wonderful definition of fascism. In the U.S., we've been given this sort of movie definition of fascism. It's just stormtroopers marching and all this stuff. But we're developing, I call it like fascism with a smiley face. It's a fascism that has a certain surface blandness to it. It's not nearly as harsh and violent as the Nazi kind, but it could get that way.
Well, I think it is. I think it's just hidden, but I think it's already there. You look at places like Gitmo and the fact that Donald Trump, for instance, has come out in favor of torture and methodology. I think there's always been an undercurrent that any violence is okay violence as long as it's good guys doing the violence.
Then it's defending freedom. It's not violence, it's defending freedom.
Exactly. To get into my metaphors about death from above and how that relates to the suicide bombers. People even talk about how violent these third world countries are, beheading people. Oh my God, they actually chop people's heads off. I'm like, well, what the fuck, man? You can only chop off, a few heads with a sword. What can you do when you drop a bomb from 30,000 feet? You blow people's limbs off from here to kingdom come. Everybody's suffering. It's thousands of times more violent, thousands of times more
Definitely.
destructive, and yet
And most
people,
of them are civilians.
yeah, exactly,
Um,
exactly. It's just, you're not places that are getting destroyed aren't, for the most part, military establishments. These are cities that people lived in, for crying out loud. Bombed out
yeah.
and live there anymore. Of course, they're going to migrate out. It amazes me that some of these places continue to function. We talk regularly. I talk with Russell Bentley. Have you listened to any of the interviews I've done with Russell?
Not yet. No, I haven't.
Russell is a guy from Texas that went over to fight Nazis in the Ukraine, in the Donetsk region,
Oh,
Donetsk People's Republic, and he's over there now. He does humanitarian work also. Just when I talk to Russell, it's like amazing. They've got 2 miles from where he's at in his place in Donetsk, there's fighting going on the front line. Meanwhile, in the
yeah.
city of Donetsk, for the moment, there's still sort of business as usual going on, and I find that shit remarkable that can happen. But
Davis has a wonderful quote about this. He says, the car bomb is the poor man's Air Force.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
That we have these huge bombers, we have the stealth bombers, and they have their Toyota Corollas. The bombers do an awful lot more damage than the Toyota
Yeah,
filled with.
well, the damage that Toyotas can do is on a information level. So it's all how it gets played up in the
Yeah.
press and how the media spins the whole thing. It does get spun in such a way that all of that type of violence, it's car bombs, suicide bombers, beheadings, etc. That's bad violence. But good violence is smart bombs and surgical strikes, and terminology that's used in the media is amazing in this way. How it's designed in such a way as to make the type of violence that is done by the industrial society is clean violence, whereas the violence done by
Yeah.
the non-industrial society, the ones that are fighting back, is dirty violence. That's just an interesting observation I've had over the years on that. I only really became aware of it in very recent years, but when you start to read stuff and once you grasp that this is what's going on, you see it all over the place. It's just really pervasive.
George Orwell described that so well, that this newspeak of just, war is peace and truth is a lie, and just if you shout these things long enough, people start to believe it, even though it's 180 degrees from reality. They don't want to deal with the reality, so they'll buy the media lie.
Lies are definitely very pervasive and used so often that they become truth. They are the truth after a while. It's what everybody accepts and operates on that level. In our parties, our political parties, lie as truth has become so endemic.
Yeah.
You absolutely can't believe a goddamn thing that comes out of a politician's mouth.
No.
If their lips are moving, they're lying. That's what that boils down to. So, all right. Well, it's a sort of situation over in Europe and how that's progressing over there. Tie it up here. Written a whole bunch of different novels. You mentioned a couple of them here early on. I'm wondering what some of the other stuff you've written is. Where
Well, I wrote a book about
the readers can access it.
A novel about the climate change. It ties into a lot of our theme. We're talking about with global warming and the energy crisis. It's called Wellsprings, A Fable of Consciousness. And that's set 10 years from now in 2026, as the Earth's ecosystem is broken down totally and facing a real doom. Water supplies are shrinking and rain is very rare, and all North America in 10 years is gripped in this huge drought. Crops are withering and forests are dying. But in the midst of this environmental and social collapse, an old woman and a young man set out to try to do something about it, to heal nature and reactivate the inner cycle of flow, but then using techniques of higher consciousness to do this. It's a fable. It's not realistic in that sense. But the corporations that control the remaining water lash out to stop them, try to smash them. And it's also a love story, which is also good for us. And that's Wellsprings.
And that sells books to the women.
Yeah. Women read much more than men do. Women are, I think, our great hope here. If we can keep them away from following these phony patriarchal women like Hillary Clinton, who are women but serving a patriarchal system, I think we have a real hope. One of my other books is about a girl, an 8-year-old Indian girl. She creates a world revolution for social justice. It's called Leela the Revolutionary. And Leela's this 8-year-old girl, and she can see that the reality that adults are blind to because she hasn't been exposed to all these official lies. No one ever told her that she couldn't end poverty and inequality. So she's convinced she can just do it. Her motto is just do it because she works in the Nike shoe factory. What her take on just do it is just overthrow this system and take it over ourselves. We own the factory. We do it. And she convinces the others that, yeah, we can do this. And damn it, they do it. They ended up on the capital of the United States, breaking the revolution there, and it eventually succeeds. So it's again, this is a fable.
That's definitely a
But it's an
fable because
inspiring
that sort of
fable.
business has been tried a few times. Generally, is beaten down in one way or another by the powers that be. I think we often run into the quote by Jay Gould, which is, you can always hire half of the population to kill the other half. And looking at the labor union movement of the 1920s, the Wobblies and so forth,
Yeah.
we talk about that all the time, and the Pinkertons and how the labor movements are busted by powers that be. There's just doing it generally, unfortunately, takes a lot of violence, and violence tends to have the state tends to have the monopoly on violence in terms of the amount of force that they can bring to bear. That whole aspect of things is very, very difficult, and that's one of the conversations we have on the diner also, violence versus nonviolence.
As the doom snowballs here, the state's monopoly on violence is going to melt away. Because the soldiers and the police are going to be caught up in this too, and they're going to start to turn against the system. That's why it's so important to work with them, to communicate with them and say, hey, what are you doing here? You're one of us. You're hurting the people you're supposed to be protecting and serving. And that's the great Achilles heel to this whole system, is that the soldiers will stop obeying the commands. They won't. That's not on the horizon yet, but that's what will eventually happen as the doom happens, as things get increasingly worse. They're going to start disobeying the commands.
It's what I call turning fire. And that's when paid for police forces and paid for armed forces no longer get paychecks. Or those paychecks are not sufficient for them to feed their own families and so forth. They can't be bought off anymore. So when you reach the point at which you get a failure of the economic system to such a level that powers that be can't buy loyalty, that's when it flips. It's a flipping point. That flipping point, it's probably not tomorrow or whatever, but I think it gets closer by the day. And in some places, it's already there.
Said that we can't really build socialism until capitalism exhausts all its potentialities. It's going to have to really break down, and we're a ways from that yet. And then we'll be able to build a new system where our lives are going to be lives of struggle. It seems to me it could be a good 50 years before we're really ready to change the economic basics we live under. So it's something we have, and 50 years isn't that long, really.
I don't think it's got 50. If it's got 20, that's going to be doing good.
Well, I hope. I hope you're right.
Well, that question is another big question that a lot of people in the doomosphere have. Is it better to hope for this thing to end faster or to take long? You don't want your level of comfort necessarily to disappear on you. And a lot of people worry about anarchy, Mad Max type scenarios that might come out of a breakdown of our economic system. So there's part of you that wants to see business as usual continue onward because your life is predictable, right? As long as you yourself have not fallen off the economic cliff yet, it seems good, right? But on the other hand, you want to see the system end because it's fucking up the planet and fucking up everybody's lives. So where do you want it to go? So I think most people would like to see the end of all things, or the end of the world as we know it, Teotihuacan, come just at the moment before they die.
Yeah, really. What the mass media does is with this is tell us, look, this we can't really change. We can't. This is just the way people are. People are inherently greedy. They're inherently violent. Peace is impossible. War is built into our genes. So just accept it, folks. And that this is overwhelmingly the message that the mass media and even a lot of academics are sending to us. They refer to research by evolutionary biologists that indicates that our closest genetic relatives, the chimpanzees, they make war. Therefore, war must be part of our heredity. It's true that in certain situations, chimpanzees do raid neighboring colonies and kill other chimps. That does happen sometimes. Those studies got enormous publicity because they implied that war is hardwired into human nature. Actually, the scientists weren't actually saying that, but the media, the mass media, kept reinforcing that message. But then it turned out they did some more research that led to a discovery that the mass media ignored. It turned out that the chimps who were invading their neighbors were suffering from shrinking territory and food sources. They were struggling for survival. It had adequate resources. In the world, we have adequate resources for everyone to have a decent life. They didn't raid other colonies. They weren't aggressive. The aggression wasn't a behavioral constant that was always there. It was created by the stress they were under. Our genes give us the capacity for violence, but the stress factor has to be there to trigger combat in chimpanzees and humans. This new research showed that war isn't inevitable. Poverty isn't inevitable, but it's a function of the stresses society is under. Our biology doesn't force us to war. It just gives us the potential for it. And without these stresses, and capitalism feeds on stress, without that stress, violence is just one of the many unexpressed capacities that human evolution has given us. A lot of the militarists would say, oh, well, history says one war after another. That's all there's been. But it turns out, if you look closer at it, the early matriarchal civilization in southeastern Europe, they had centuries of peace. Excavations of several ancient cultures has shown no evidence of war. It's really, when you look at Western patriarchal civilization, yeah, it's war. But there have been many exceptions to this that say, well, that's just as a result of that culture. If we build a different culture, we can have peace.
Well, I think one of the problems here is what you mentioned early on with the chimps is the resource issue and the fact that we've basically gone on an unrestricted breeding spree and increasing the population size. And it's not all that clear to me that there really is enough resources for 7.2 billion people and climbing to adequately share on the planet. And I think that's where the real problem lies here, is that you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. Gail Tverberg talks about that all the time, and that's what the basis of the limits to growth study was. When you look at the type of growth that human beings have experienced over the last 100 years, explosive exponential growth in population, and the resources just aren't there. It's not just the oil resource, it's the water resource. And then it's the atmosphere itself, to all the pollutants you're putting up in the atmosphere. So you end up swimming in your own sewage. It's like yeast in a vat or bacteria in a petri dish, all those metaphors. The deer on St. Matthew's Island. You reach this crisis point, this critical point, where your population size becomes so large that you no longer can share everything. Somebody's got to die. That's, I think, the point we've worked ourselves up to that nobody wants to recognize. Certainly not the political class, and not the Joe Sixpack either. Conceding the fact that a large portion of the population is destined for death is a very, very difficult thing for most people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If we really had a cooperative society, though, we could instigate a good birth control program. It's going to take some nudging, and it's not going to happen right away. But that's a problem we can lick, don't you think?
Well, I think the Chinese tried it, their one-child policy, and that led into was basically a demographic nightmare of a huge number of old people and not enough young people coming up after them.
It also led to
I think on the general level that Homo saps have not shown a real good ability at maintaining their population size in the position where they have a surplus. So if you have a surplus, you breed comfortable, you got a nice house, you got enough food coming in, you can afford to have a kid, so you have a kid, right? We have two, we have three. The deal is, on a global level, to look at species behavior on the global level rather than the individual level. On the global level, we don't operate a whole lot different than unintelligent species, than non-sentient species. Breeding situation goes on as a problem. I'm not sure that it is possible to control birth rates consciously through birth control. I don't believe that's possible. I only believe that it is possible to gain a balance between death rates and birth rates. And if you go back to hunter-gatherer communities, when they were in deficit, could not afford a new child that was born, that child was exposed. That child was left on a mountain to die. That kind of hard, those kind of hard choices, I think, are coming back to us now, and will come back to us in spades over these next decades, because the Earth is overstressed. It can't support 7.2 billion people. It's as simple as that. That's the way I see that one.
Well, what about the
Very
argument, though,
depressing, I
that
know.
a lot of the population explosion in the poor countries is because they have so little economic security that they need the kids to take care of. They need more kids coming along because the kids have to take care of the parents then.
Not only
And
that,
that's how
but
it's
they have
built.
higher child mortality rates. So
Yeah.
you can't be certain that your kid, even if born, is going to live past 5 years old, because a lot of them die. So they have more kids
Yeah.
for that.
But if we solve that problem, then if they realize that, they are going to be taken care of in their old age by the society, that they're not depending on their children, that would help also.
Yeah, and I think that has been a dream. That's why we have socialist systems. We have Social Security here in the fascist states of America. Europe had a fairly good retirement pension system up till recent years. As resources run thinner, pension systems of all sorts are breaking down because they're all kind of Ponzi's. They're dependent on more kids and more work being done in the tiers below them. And so if that doesn't happen, then those funds aren't paid into, and eventually you run out of money unless you manufacture out of thin air, which is what's going on right now in a lot of places. So it's a real tough question overall.
It's an incredibly complex, tough question.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I think the only way it's going to be solved by a lot of dead people. But anyway, all right. Well, this was a good first conversation with William. William's going to be contributing more blogs to the diner over time here. We are proud to welcome him as one of our bloggers, native bloggers on the diner. He's got a few books that he mentioned out that you can go and pick up online from Amazon or wherever. His website is peacewriter.org, and
You can read chapters of all the books there. In some cases, you can read the whole book there. peacewriter.org. Yeah, I'm glad to be a part of the team here as we go down here on our Titanic, singing
the journey to somewhere, to the other side, as I like to say. See you on the other side of what I don't know, but there is another side to this, and at some point we're going to cross over to the other side, and then we will deal with the future as it comes then. There's very, very difficult to make much changes in the way things are going on now. There's a pedal to the metal sort of aspect, and got a huge hunk of metal traveling at a very fast speed, and you just can't slam on the brakes. It doesn't happen that way. There's too much inertia. So we'll be talking to William again.
Surfing the apocalypse of doom here. We just enjoy what we can and do what we can to make a better world, and then to enjoy what we can of when we have.
That's right. And the way we put that on the diner is save as many as you can. That's
all right.
All the doom. This
Good.
time until next time. Here.
Nice
on
talking
the
to you,
Doomstead
already.
Diner.
Yeah.
You too, William. Bye-bye.
Good day.